I can't. I look weirder than my glasses on. Honorable Chair, ready? Opponents ready? Good. Awesome. Honorable Chair, we would like to make this assertion that I'm sorry, I can't see at all. I'm blind. I'm sorry. Like, I can't read my paper.
Do you have your glasses?
They're lost. They're gone.
Come close to your face.
Yeah, I'd just like to point that out. I'm sorry that
Okay,
I just
do
meant
you
this
want to
earlier.
restart the time?
What? Yeah.
I'm going to restart the time, but your Prime Minister in our trial round, which we need to do today, so
Yes,
you
it's okay.
speech,
Yes,
right?
fine.
And we'll
Yes.
take that under consideration when we decide who's going to. I'll tell the judges that you didn't see your notes.
It's totally
You're
fine.
letting us speech.
It's okay. Yes.
Ready to go?
All right. Yes.
All right. Good.
All right, Honorable Chair. This House believes that this House would pay all elected officials in the United States the federal minimum wage. We would like to emphasize, of course, as it states in the motion, that this is in the United States only. We're not focusing on other countries and Western liberal democracies. This is mostly going to focus on the United States and the United States only. Also, we would like to make we would also like to make the emphasis that this is going to focus on all officials, not just congressional, not just the executive branch. We're talking about on the state level. We're talking about county clerk, dog catcher, etc. And this proposal is going to go into effect immediately. And we would like to make the claim that this is not something that's going to turn the United States into, or our democracy into utopia. This is not something that's going to fix all. This is something that's merely going to improve our democracy, improve our republic, and not necessarily turn everything into a giant kumbaya. For the following points. One, we would weed out all greedy candidates, those who only go into who we would call career politicians, those who go into the political arena merely to make money. This process, by making these officials get paid the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, we would essentially be encouraging candidates who would want to come and be public servants sort of for a minimum or a temporary amount of time. For example, as the framers of our Constitution sort of wanted to happen, they weren't expecting what we see today, such as career politicians, people who are politicians for 20 or 30 years, keep getting reelected, keep having incumbency privilege. What they framed, or what they saw in America, was sort of your common man, your average Joe, sort of going in and trying to get elected in order to serve their constituents the best way that they can. And so by allowing or forcing these politicians to sort of be paid $7.25 an hour, you sort of reinstitute that meritocracy, you reinstitute that original idea that the framers of the Constitution had. Secondly, many people might have this question like, oh, what would be the incentive for these politicians to do the work that they're supposed to do, to make laws, to sort of invest money into their communities? Why would they want to do that if they're only getting paid $7.25 an hour? And the answer to that is that there should be no incentive. If you want to do public service, you should do it because you want to, because it makes you happy, because it improves your community, not because you're going to make $400,000 or $300,000 a year. More information.
Do you think that everyone is entitled to a minimum living wage?
I do believe that people are entitled to a minimum living wage, and that's sort of the point that I'm getting at, that I will get to later. Three, I would like to make this point that this refocuses the political agenda / the political conversation on poverty in the United States. We have millions of people in the United States who live below the poverty line, people who live paycheck to paycheck. Sometimes they have to work 2 jobs, 3 jobs. They have to work graveyard shifts, etc. And many of today's politicians, even on the local level, don't really get that message. They live comfortably. They're able to they have mansions, they have multiple properties, etc. They get a lot of tax exemptions. They get free health care, which many of them are trying to take away. And by forcing them to sort of live on $7.25 an hour, sort of living as the bare minimum getting paid that many Americans, many clerks, many cashiers, many people who work in the fast food industry have to get paid, it sort of refocuses that conversation. They kind of finally start to realize how the average American, or how many working class Americans have to live day by day. Also, an important point that we'd like to make is that spending their own money on things like campaign financing, on having to mail their constituencies, etc., sort of closes the gap that has been brought out since money has entered politics since the beginning of this republic, you might argue. It sort of allows them to sort of come more down to earth, be humbled, sit down, and this sort of it increases a trust between constituent and representative. Yes.
So to clarify, you're saying that they're paying for their own campaigns now out of pocket, more so?
More so, well, they originally had to pay. They always have to pay out of pocket. However, I'd like to make this just to clarify that because they're living on a wage of $7.25 an hour, it sort of hits more. It cuts deeper in because they can't afford to spend millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars on things that they otherwise would have had they been making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So again, as I was talking about, it sort of closes this gap that's been made. People have lost a lot of trust in their politicians because they often make a lot of money. They funnel a lot of money in. A lot of Americans are very disengaged in the political process for very good reasons because they feel that they can't connect because those rich fat cats in Washington don't really understand, or those rich fat cats in Austin or Montpelier or whatever state you're living in don't necessarily sort of connect. But once that person who's working on the side of the road or working at McDonald's, etc., sort of can finally understand that their politicians also making the same amount of money that they are, it sort of allows them to sort of invest themselves in the political process. For example, I believe it was something around half of Americans who were eligible to vote did not vote in this past election. But the problem is that we see that almost every election cycle, people aren't invested. And by sort of bringing these politicians more down to earth, sort of giving them a more common wage, it allows people to get more invested, and that's what we want to strengthen our democracy: a much more invested populace, a much more invested electorate, and this helps with that. Also, my penultimate point is that if they do want to get paid better, if they want to increase their wages, they can do that. They can make a law, they can write a bill saying that we want to get paid more, and that benefits all of us. Once the minimum wage is raised, mothers won't have to work 3 or 4 jobs to get their kids to school. People won't have to work out in the heat and sun for as long. They won't have ailments that are work-related, etc. And so that is what I have, please.
Great, thank you.
You're here.
All right, firstly, I want to say that most elected officials who depend on that income are already trying to change the minimum wage. And this is a really important point because we think that there are a few fundamental misunderstandings of what would happen if we were to implement this policy. And we think that it's really, really important to point those out. So first, we think that this would lower accessibility into politics. We think that people don't really get into politics. Those greedy people that my opponent was talking about don't get into politics for the money. If they were going for the money, they would get into banking. They get into politics for the power. And we think that it's really important to note that over 70% of Congress are millionaires. So already, you pretty much have to be independently wealthy in order to run for office. And we think that people who are already depending on those wages, which by the way, don't exceed $200,000 at all. So I don't know where these big, like $400,000 wages you're talking about came from. But we already don't really pay elected officials in excess. But on to that later. So first off, when we take away the ability for people to have a living wage, because we don't believe that $7.25 is a living wage, and we especially don't think $7.25 is a living wage in Washington, D.C., where a lot of elected officials are. So we think that this would actually take away any opportunity for people who are actually part of the working class to become invested in politics at all. And we think that this would basically limit investment to the independently wealthy. And we think this is super problematic because on their side of the house, you wouldn't get people like Elizabeth Warren, who came from another, from a teaching job because she wanted to actually change the country. And you would only get people like Congressman Pierce, who has millions of dollars and is famous for saying that wives should voluntarily submit to their husbands, right? So we think that you're actually going to get more of these very independently wealthy Republicans who are already firmly opposed to raising the minimum wage, who just wouldn't care what the wage is one way or another. Secondly, we think that this is a really bad idea because for the people that it does actually impact, for the people that do depend on the wage for Congress, for Congress or any elected officials, they're much more likely to take bribes. And we think that this is really problematic because we take away the ability for any elected officials to actually like hold their ground and be able to like walk the straight and narrow when they don't actually have the ability to live without taking like excessive speech fees or bribes from different parties. And we think that it's really important that when people are like absolutely unable to finance their own campaigns, like our opponents brought up, that they're going to be financed by probably other people like oil companies. And this is already kind of happening, and we already have like not excessive wages, but we think that this would make it just a severe case. I'll take back up.
So other than that, there are already mechanisms to control for bribes in the status quo. Would you say that it's a bad thing to encourage individuals that succeed in other industries or in other fields to pursue careers, maybe not for monetary gain, but because they've already made a significant fortune in another field and succeeded in that field?
So you're saying that it's a good thing to only have independently wealthy people running the country. All right. We think that it's possible that like if somebody has gone into like a scientific field, that would be that experience might be relevant to whatever field that they're taking, but we think that people that go into other fields that we would want, like science, like teaching, those kinds of things, they're not going to become independently wealthy in those fields. And actually, if they're going to go from a field where they make like a pretty living wage into a field where they're not making a living wage, that's like de-incentivizes that switch anyway. So even if that is the case, the people that we want tend to like not be in the industries that they will be able to become independently wealthy, but that it would actually de-incentivize those people from making the switch to politics. Next, we think that it's really that the minimum wage is not a living wage, and we want to be able to fix that. So we think that the people that are most likely to fix that are people that actually do depend on the wage that they're given. So these elected officials that do depend on the like $80,000 that they're given for working in Congress, right? And we think that those people are already working to fix it. So I mentioned Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, those are the people that are actually working to fix it. And if we don't have people that actually do depend on a wage at all, and we only have people that are independently wealthy, we actually think that there's going to be less chance that minimum wage will be raised because those people just like don't care one way or another about the wage of Congress. And we think that to respond to this point about like this is not what the framers had in mind, when the framers created like Congress, they had in mind a much shorter session, and that didn't change with increased wages. That changed with the advent of air conditioning. So I don't think that's super relevant to the round what exactly our forefathers had envisioned. But next, we wanted to talk about political will. If there is the political will to pay all elected officials in the federal minimum wage, and we think that if this is a thing that's possible, then it's probably much more possible to just raise the minimum wage, which is what we're trying to do in the first place. So we think that this is like a very roundabout way of doing something that we don't think is actually going to have any of the impacts that they brought to us, but that also if we have the will to do this, why don't we make a living wage? And we think that this is like a much better alternative. Moving on a little bit, our opponents said that this would like increase the amount of trust that we have in politics, but we think that if you're having people that are like much more likely to like take these massive speaking fees, or much more likely to do things that like tend to be corrupt because they don't have enough money to live on, that's actually going to like decrease the trust of the public in those people. But we also think that if you only have people that are like able to fly back and forth to and from DC, which already on the what Congress is being paid, that's like a lot of work and kind of impossible unless you have like some kind of wealth backed up. But so we think that like if you make it totally impossible for anyone who actually depends on a wage to be working in DC, we think that that's going to actually further decrease the trust that the public has in those people. Because like This is basically like saying, why don't we just take away all of the money in general? And they've done that in certain situations. Like in ancient Greece, like these positions weren't necessarily paid. And what that does is it makes it so that only like the very higher class are able to take those positions. And we think that this is like exactly the opposite of the route that we want to be going. They also said that this would stop career politicians, but we think that that's absolutely not true. And we think that generally, even in the status quo, people become career politicians after they have like accrued this wealth already. So people don't go into politics in order to like make a ton of money, which we can see because like the highest paid district worker for different congressmen makes less than $80,000 a year. So we don't think that you go into these fields in order to make all of this money anyway, and we think that this would just be really detrimental to the working class and make it completely inaccessible to go into politics. For these reasons, we strongly oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister.
Honorable panelists and honorable chair, I'd like to bring forth at first a few points of rebuttal, and then I'll expand upon the points that my partner, the Prime Minister, made. All right. So first of all, the LO brought up this point that that elected officials are already like trying really hard to change the minimum wage. However, I'd like to argue that like it hasn't changed and it won't budge. And like, what do you think would change the mind of the people who you characterize as like being very greedy and like won't like care one way or another? I'd like to argue that if they are so greedy, if they like love money so much, then their wages like for these elected like positions that they have, like if the wages change, then it will bring this issue like to hand. It will like make this issue relevant, and it would also like really humanize and like make relevant to these people who like are already like characterized as being very out of touch, like very like stereotypically like elitist, like not really with the citizens that they serve. It would like it would make relevant these issues, just like this minimum wage, this living wage, to these people. And like if they are like treated like public, no thank you, because like at the core of our argument, like we believe that all these elected officials should have the federal minimum wage because at the core they are public servants, they are civil servants, like, and they are getting paid with government money. And I'm going to expand on this point later. Like government money should not be used in the way that it is in the status quo, like making these wages like very large for these like civil servants who are elected. And additionally, the leader of opposition brought up that it would like lower accessibility into politics, like. But I'm not really seeing the link here because people who are already independently wealthy, like most likely will not be looking like so hard to enter to like get these like elected positions because they do not because like without these wages, without this promise of like all this money and power, then like the chances are that the people who are looking to run for these positions and to get elected, like, will be more in it for, like, the service and, like, be more characterized as, like, actual, like, public servants and civil servants. And additionally, the leader of opposition said that it would, like, take the ability away for people to take away the living wage. However, as I already illustrated before, they would most likely care more. And, like, additionally, it was brought up in a POI that they, like, in the status quo, there are already, like, measures to stop people from taking bribes. And however, like, if bribes are already taken in the status quo and, like, the system, these, like, elected officials are already so often corrupt, then, like, then this change is, like, it might be, like, meager, it might be, like small. However, like, this change, this more, like, humanization of elected officials by paying them the minimum wage, is, like, it is at least a step, and like, and the impacts of this are like stronger than, what if somebody like takes bribes? What if there's a corrupt official? And like also, since these are elected officials, any official that has like been known to be corrupt or like is taking these bribes and like the people don't trust them, then like the chances are less likely that they'll be the chances are less likely that they'll be elected, and that more that somebody who the people can relate to will be elected, somebody who identifies with the citizens that they serve. Additionally, as my partner brought up before, these people would not necessarily like be living in poverty. Like they can still make though this like base wage is like the federal minimum wage, and it's like the official money that they're getting like from the government. They can like still make money. They will still be able to live day to day outside and like fund their campaigns outside of this minimum wage, because they'll be more incentivized to earn the endorsement of like different donors. They'll be more
Here.
Yeah, well, like, why should people shouldn't be using their wages to fund their different campaigns to like if it's already so futile, if it already exists in the status quo, then like people will be more incentivized. These elected officials will be searching to like earn the trust of the people and also like earn the trust of like different donors to fund their election campaigns. Additionally, no thank you. Additionally, all right, so as my partner so eloquently like pointed out, like hopefully this is a step to take that people will actually like people who actually would like to serve their citizens and to like actually make a difference in like the public sphere. It will incentivize more of these people to try to run for these positions, because there won't be like these promises of like grand salaries, whatever. If people are already independently wealthy and they don't really care about like the public service, and they have all these problematic opinions, and like hopefully on our side of the house they won't be elected. And additionally, like this would also refocus the conversation of the minimum wage, as my partner pointed out, and like any step, we agree that like that it can be like very that like living on the minimum wage is like a widespread problem. However, the impacts and like the significance of like extending this minimum wage that so many Americans live on to their elected officials, like closing the gap that already exists between elected officials and the people that they serve, like this, the impact of like this refocused conversation and like this like renewed like this incentive to like renew trust in elected officials definitely outweighs any like modeling that they could have on the other side of the house, which I'm guessing is like keeping these wages like really large unnecessarily, especially for public servants, when really the money could be going to other uses. So with these points, I am happy to propose.
Leader up.
Honorable speakers, the U.S. government is already trending towards having a power elite. You can see this trend very easily if you look at the kinds of people who are elected to the most influential governmental positions in our country. You look at people like the Kennedy dynasty, and notice that language. You look at people like John Kerry, who married the heir to the Heinz ketchup fortune just to further his political career. This is the kind of money that it takes to make it big in the electoral system in the United States. We think that this is a problem, that it already exists and that this resolution will only worsen this problem by making elected positions even less accessible to members of the middle and working class in our country, with extremely negative impacts for the type of policy outcomes that we will get from these elected officials who are even more rich, even more out of touch than they otherwise would be. I'm going to start with a couple points of extraneous rebuttal from what we just heard from side government, and then I'm going to weave the rest of my refutation into some rebuilding and extension of Saren's points that you heard. So first of all, we get this idea that basically this would weed out greedy candidates. Saren already told you that elected officials really just aren't paid that well in the United States. If the salary is what's driving them, there are other better salary jobs that they'd be going for, right? They'd be going to work in the private sector. They'd be going to work in Wall Street. If you look at other sources of income for elected officials, things like speech fees, which in fact are sometimes quite considerable if you are a really powerful elected official, those still exist in their world. So if that's the greed that's driving them, no change due to this resolution. But furthermore, we hear from side government basically that this will make the elected officials make the issue of the minimum wage relevant to them. We think that it's only fair to look at this in terms of different categories of elected officials and how this will differently impact them. So there's the kind of really powerful, really rich elected official that tends to sit in seats on, say, Congress, but also in other places throughout the world, the kinds of people who have enough money to win the really contested campaigns that require lots of money. And we think that for these people, changing their salary, which really wasn't that much, it was pretty much a drop in the bucket compared to their general income to begin with and general wealth to begin with, won't change anything. It's not going to change what they care about. It really is not a meaningful change to them. But secondly, we can look at the people who did somehow manage to beat those odds, those people who come from the middle class, who come from the working class, who actually do depend on the income that they get from this job to live, to feed their families, to buy things like clothing, and maybe, perhaps, to finance parts of their campaign. And we think that by taking away this income, you create a really negative change in terms of accessibility, right? So either they won't try to be elected because they know that they can't feed their families on this kind of salary, or they just know that it's super unlikely that they would manage to win because they can't invest the current money that they have with the expectation that they will have more money once they receive this salary because they're getting a salary that is not a living wage, which is pretty much acknowledged by everyone. Or they somehow do manage to get elected, and we actually get this analysis from Ilana herself, and then what they need to do is they need to really court donors with lots of money. This means that the issues they care about are the issues that donors with lots of money care about, right? So if anything, it makes these people who somehow manage to beat the odds that we've already have stacked against them more beholden to the kind of moneyed interests of the essentially ruling elite in America than they otherwise would have been. We think they've pretty much undermined their entire case themselves with this analysis, and we think it's really problematic. So again, the really negative impacts of this is that we end up with fewer people from kind of less rich, less privileged backgrounds in elected office. We think that's problematic because those people are less likely to fight for the kinds of issues that everyone's pretty much is just assuming is a good idea in this round, the kinds of liberal policies that help the working class, that help poor people, and we think that that is the most serious impact in this round. It's what we ought to care most about. We get a couple other really vague arguments aside from this getting better, more liberal policies for the working class out of Ilana's last speech. First of all, she gave us a little bit of analysis about how, like, this is just a principle thing, right? Like, government money ought not be put towards paying the salary of elected officials. They should just be doing it for the love of the job. Well, we think if you look at this through a pragmatic lens, that's actually kind of silly. And if in any way paying them at least a living wage, and hopefully a little bit more than that, will make these positions more accessible, that's a good thing. It leads to a more functional democracy. If anything, this is the kind of thing we should be putting more money into, right? We want campaign finance reform. We want support for people who don't have the kind of fortunes to be in with to make it more accessible.
Sure.
This is one piece of that that makes those kinds of people from other more diverse backgrounds more likely to run, and we think that it'd be really problematic to take it away. Lastly, we get the idea that this somehow would refocus the conversation and renew the trust. First of all, we think that because of the analysis we've already given you, putting more rich people in Congress and forcing out all the poor people in really simplistic terms is not going to renew the trust. It will do the opposite. People will look and see an even less representative government than they are used to, and nothing will happen. We also think that if you do have this kind of political will, that maybe you should actually focus the conversation on what we all kind of are hinting that it should be focused at, the policies about the minimum wage that are so problematic in the first place, right? So like, this is what we want the conversation focused on. We don't think that necessarily changing the senators' wages in a way that makes no meaningful difference to the rich senators will do anything to help us. So that's kind of my refutation and extension on Sarah's point. I want to extend further one more area that we haven't talked a lot about, and that is the people who are currently in these elected offices throughout the country, in towns all over the place, who aren't rich already, right? We think that this change will asymmetrically impact them because they're not the ones who can fall back on their daddy's fortune that has been amassed since like colonial times. What will this happen? What will this do to them? We think that there are a couple different negative things that will happen. A, it might push them out of office because they just can't afford to have that job anymore. They're going to need a different job. B, it'll make them more vulnerable to money interests. We've already talked about all this. But C, let's say best case scenario. You get someone super idealistic, really, really loves this job, is going to stay no matter what, even if it means moving to like a trailer home and eating Wheaties every day, whatever. We think that this person then ends up having to go to extreme lengths, which will make them less effective, right? They might have to work 2 jobs. That means less time to engage in the political conversations than do political work that we want them to be doing. It means that they can't afford clothes that will help them look presentable in the kind of TV race that elections are today. And it means they're less likely to get reelected. We think that these are examples of really pragmatic impacts of this accessibility point that we've brought you today. We're convinced this is the core of this debate, and we are extremely proud to oppose. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Then in the back half,
I'm Tarek.
Oh, I forgot to say who I was. The last speaker was Kaylee.
and can we confirm that that's still videotaping, right?
Yep.
Great. If you're ready, Tarek.
As closing government, we would like to take the opening government's model a step further. We are even okay if the minimum wage was the sole source of income for these elected officials. That means freezing their assets. This resolution would be the first step in doing so. And I would also like to point out that as the opening opposition stated that politics is about power, but we would like to, and then we actually agree with this, and that independently wealthy people, which wouldn't be interested in running, would actually be interested in running because they stated politics is about power, not about the money, and that's why we prefer that the minimum wage is their sole source of income, and that freezing their assets is the goal of this resolution. So to begin, when opening government talked about fat cats and these people who have been in government for a long time, and there's been a lot of clash between whether these types of people are good and whether the government should be run sort of as whoever can make the most money wins. Well, we actually prefer these fat cats, but in specific, no thank you, not right now, but in specific the smart fat cats. Let me explain. So elected officials which are able to derive skills through success. So Mark Zuckerberg, for example, someone who truly understands the interconnected global world, is able to and is a perfect communicator in the 21st century. He is a man who's succeeded and is one of the richest people in the world and one of the most influential in the world. And we can, and dare I say, would be a pretty good politician, and many of us would prefer him over people who simply buy themselves into office with good campaigns, or people who are on The Celebrity Apprentice and somehow become president, cough cough. So these Mark Zuckerberg or Mark Cuban, Elon Musk, these types of people who really have expertise and knowledge in specific fields that actually tackle 21st century issues. These are the types of elected officials that we want in office. So we want to remove this monetary aspect of politics and sort of take it more into the power, which the opening opposition mentioned. So yes, go ahead.
All right, so you want to have Elon Musk stop running Tesla and stop going towards Mars and instead take away all of his money and then put him in Congress?
So first, we believe that his company can run without him. He has built executives and all these brilliant people around him. He has a cohesive unit. It's not all about Elon Musk. He's a picture, and behind the picture, there's thousands of people which are helping him run this company. So, and also, we believe that these types of brilliant people who are able to succeed in the 21st century, who are able to understand how humanity can progress collectively and on an individual basis, with personal success, that this in specific is what we need in politicians today. No, thank you. So, secondly, moving away from politicians, we would like to emphasize the importance of civil servants in this round. So, with our model, by voting for our motion, civil servants will become more prioritized. So by sort of shifting the money away from career politicians and paying the president and others hundreds of thousands of dollars, which racks up if you think about the hundreds of different, even thousands of elected officials across the country in state and federal governments and even local governments. So thank you. That these civil servants will be compensated more, that there is more money to go around, and that we will have potentially less competent elected officials, but definitely more competent civil servants, which are the true backbone of the government. So we can all agree that politicians are the face, are the pretty picture in front of the argument. But behind all the argument comes the analysis, comes the hard work of the civil servants, of those who really put the blood, sweat, and tears to make the government work and our society work, and they ought to be compensated fully. So our resolution allows us to rely on people who worked in government for their entire lives and actually have this moral sense and this they're not typically driven by sort of by greed or lust for power or anything like that. That they will aim to be in government so they can be paid more. They can be paid more, but also they have been doing so the entire time because they actually care about our society and the issues at hand. So, and also a brief third point, that more representation in government would occur, and this is because people of all sorts of skill levels and not just those who have witty slogans and great campaign finance avenues, that this would increase representation in general, and that the appeal of becoming an elected official for monetary gain would decrease. So those who just run for yes, go ahead.
Okay, so can you clarify your model a little bit and explain why you wouldn't just freeze assets, which would uniquely hurt those who already have amassed assets, and explain instead the unique benefits of freezing assets and the minimum wage element, which only hurts those who don't have assets to begin with?
Right, so we believe that those who are able to succeed in this society through this meritocracy, that those are the individuals that we want running this country. We want those individuals to be making choices for the society as a whole. So those who are able to succeed, for example, Mark Zuckerberg, these are uniquely brilliant people that should be in the forefront. And to stress, if we could imagine a 2016 election without Hillary Clinton, but with Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, someone who is not a career politician, someone who does not have a lot of baggage, but has expertise and has appeal similar to Donald Trump, but is a much more eloquent speaker and could probably run a damn better campaign through just their expertise in advertising, then they would win. So yes, overall, we make the government run better by finally compensating people who do the difficult work, and we develop officials who are true experts in their fields And that matters into 21st century. We're talking about 21st century politics and not 19th or 20th century politics where it's all about this very minutia in politics. So overall, we would like to emphasize the importance of civil servants and sort of compensating them and shifting the expertise from elected officials. Thank you.
Opposition member.
My name is Teal, by the way. So we think this debate really boils down to like a disagreement on sides. So the government says that if we decrease the minimum, or we pay elected officials the minimum wage, then the politicians and all these elected officials will get better. We don't think that makes sense whatsoever. Like, why would paying people less money improve the people who want to go into that position? And on the other side, we have our argument, which is that we think this will characteristically make elected officials worse. So let's dive into like one piece of extension that I'd like to bring to the debate, and this has to do with not just the people in Washington and DC. This has to do with all the other elected officials that they talk about, like county clerks and like people at the state level and like Supreme Court justices in like states such as Wisconsin and things like that. So for these people, there's comparatively less money in the government world, which means that the government, it's like not this side, but the federal government and the state government isn't able to compete. They weren't even able to do it in the first place, but even more so, they won't be able to compete with corporations and tech companies and other industry forces. We think this will make the government, the federal government itself, worse off because of two reasons. The first of which is that people won't be going, like, people who would have otherwise gone into government work and become an elected official will now go into corporations and technology instead, and will be left over with the people who aren't as talented anymore. So that comparatively makes governments worse. The second thing here to note is that there isn't an incentive and structure anymore to do well. So like whether you collect dogs off the side of the road or you're like a Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin, you're getting paid the same thing. So really, is there a reason to like advance along the social ladder? And we think this takes away an incentive, which is key to improving government work and also creating that advancement in the workforce, which is also key to such positions as management. And we don't think there will be as much management and as much challenge and as much incentive on the government side of the bench. So let's go into a little bit of refutation on what the closing government just brought up. So they said they're going to freeze elected officials' assets, and I'm unclear on whether this is like they're saying we're modeling this now. But so let's assume that they're not modeling this. So we already can't stop Trump from like paying himself when he goes to Mar-a-Lago. Do we really think we'll be able to freeze the accounts and all the assets of elected officials? This just won't happen. And we think it's like unfair to fiat, even if this is something they'll do on the model for the closing gov. And also another point here is, which is like, even if they can fiat it and you are freezing the assets of all the elected officials, that just means they're going to depend on wealthy people even more. So either way, either wealthy people themselves are going to office, or now they're depending on more wealthy people. So let's go into this like element of a story. So I want to like tell you a narrative today, and that is that like government workers or elected officials aren't getting paid enough. This will make it even worse. So they won't get paid like enough to have a senator lifestyle or to campaign on their own, or even like have the image of a politician inviting other people over for dinner. Like they won't be able to do that on this like government minimum wage salary, and especially in the case of people living in like DC or capitals. And like we think this is some like really great work coming out of the opening government where they like maybe won't even have access to like sleep because they're working 2 jobs or food. So we'd like to extend the impact of this. One of the impacts that we think is going to happen is that there's going to be a conflict of interest. So if someone goes into a position, they aren't going to, and they just simply don't have enough money, they're going to figure out a way to compensate themselves. So in an extreme case, this could like undermining the government's position in terms of like corporations. Because let's say if someone is in a position to influence policy on a corporation and the corporation has money, they're more likely to be bribed by this, which we think undermines the government. And also, we think this costs the federal government more. So like one of the impacts we see coming out of closing gov is that we're saving money. That's not the case if the government workers are being bribed and are doing work that like undermines what the government is trying to do. And the second impact we see that hasn't been touched on at all is that of loopholes, right? So if they're being paid the federal minimum wage, maybe they'll also be compensated in like packages or stipends beyond whatever like term limit they're set for. And these are all different ways that they're going to get money no matter what. But in this case, it's seen as corruption, and it'll probably cost more because they're going to create loopholes which advantage themselves even more. We also think this goes into like the impact of the wealthy people being in office, and I'd like to extend on this a little bit more as well, which is that so either people don't have as much money to campaign, in which case only wealthy people are going to office, or they're depending on wealthy donors. Either way, this narrows the interests of the people who are in office, which we think is comparatively worse, and makes it worse for the elected officials and for the government as a whole. Okay, so let's do some work on some of the impacts coming out of the opening government. So they say that like people will be in it for service, but comparatively people will go out of government into industry as a result of this, and even if they stay in government, they're going to undermine the government by like doing things such as taking bribes or having like conflicts of interest or even compensating themselves legit packages that cost more. The second impact we see is that somehow this will convince senators to raise the minimum wage, and we don't think this has been addressed in this round. So I'd like to do that right now. We don't think this will happen, first because there's a party line. Like there's a very strong party line that Republicans are against this. So, and also the only people who are making this decision are the ones who are in like the Senate and the House of Representatives or the President. So it's like a very small group of people. They are going to be impacted. So, like, the Koch brothers will single-handedly pay every one of them, like, more of a wage. That's how much of a vested interest there is in the party to not have this happen. So we don't think that'll happen. And second, there'll also be loopholes. So do you think it's more likely that even if a senator is like, oh shit, it really sucks to be on a minimum wage, do you think they're going to be like, oh, we should change that for everyone? Or do you think they're going to create a loophole or a package that benefits themselves so they no longer have to be on the minimum wage? We think that's a far more likely outcome. Also, so you're seeing this impact of like more talent, like the wealthy people are more talented who are going into government on the closing government side of the house. We don't think this is going to happen because they really don't draw out how does paying people the minimum wage make Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk want to go into government. There's no work here, and there's no mechanism that they're using. But second, we think the far more likely outcome is that for all of the people who aren't in D.C. or Washington or who aren't high-powered, there will be more of an incentive for the talented people who would otherwise go into government because they want to do it for a service, go into industry instead. So if we really care about having industry people in government, the vast majority of them will go out of it to tech companies because they simply won't be able to the government simply won't be able to compete with the stipend and the money that tech companies are paying. Thank you very much.
It's still running.
So you just heard a lot of what the Extension Speaker Teal did was really not engage with our points during this debate, where we ask that we try to engage with the spirit of the debate, which is we want to shift what politics is. We want to shift the way in which government is run. How do we do that? We do that by taking the emphasis off of elected officials, making being an elected official something that one would do for an image, for power, like opening opposition put it very nicely. They wouldn't go into politics because of, for example, money. We don't necessarily think that they do this in the status quo, but we do think that we see an overwhelming amount of really wealthy people. And we think that you get more of an impact when you say that you have no more access to your resources, that your only income, and we think that this is how you really lean into this debate, your only income as a politician, your only source of money is that federal minimum wage that you get paid. So with regards to the impact of actually getting the minimum wage raised in any way, we think that you get that a lot more when you really embrace the scope of this debate and really say that what is happening is that it's not just politicians are getting paid a federal minimum wage, it's that politicians are no longer able to rely on speaking fees, is that politicians have to live like normal Americans, or like the most underpaid Americans. We also think that the debate was really mischaracterized because we don't with side when Teal says the side opposition really wants believes that elected officials will be worse, while we believe is that with the minimum wage we get necessarily better people. We think that we get more. We think that we get people that pursue government for reasons other than that kind of idealist, I want to make the world better. Because where do the people that want to make the world better go? They become civil servants. And that's what Teal didn't engage with. Because we think that real change in government doesn't happen in Congress when people make really fancy speeches and not much gets done, when people take votes. And we think that, if anything, you get people that are more present in the public eye than career politicians. We think that you get more people that are more amenable to changes in public opinion, like you see many chief executives are. So what we're doing is we're making that the peak of their career ladder, but we're not making that the place to go for that idealist that really wants to make the world better but can't afford to. We are saying that that person should become a civil servant, not an elected official. And we think that this works on all levels of whether it be federal and state government, because even in state governments, we think that elected officials have a fair amount of sway and that those positions are equally appealing. And not necessarily less so. We also think that their analysis on loopholes is, again, skirting the debate. Point? We don't necessarily think, not right now, we don't necessarily think that is what is going to be happening. And if and just that entire analysis avoids the question of, can we shift government to make it look like this? So let's just go through what this debate kind of looked like. And I think that in the top half you have this question of what is the most effective mechanism to change the minimum wage? I think that's what you see in the top half, and you have one side saying that we should have people with fewer means engage with politics, that we should get them into elected positions. Whereas our opening half says that that politicians are now more incentivized. We think that with our leaning into this model and with our making this model so much more firm, you get that impact a whole lot more. Because when people that have been used to a very cushy lifestyle become politicians, which we necessarily think they will because of the power aspect and because of that image of being in the public eye, that's why people like Mark Zuckerberg, that's why people like Elon Musk would want to be in office. We think that when they are in office and they are forced to live on that minimum wage, then that's when that minimum wage would increase. That's when you see that difference, and that's when you see that happening. So we think that we really expand on that argument, make it much more solid. We also heard this back and forth, this clash about how do we allow our government to be more represented, and we think that our government is really represented if you stop looking at Congress. Congress is a whole bunch of millionaires. We respect that. We also think that the millionaires that are in Congress right now are not the ones that would stay in Congress if they were forced to live on $750. We think that they're the types that really enjoy putting on fancy suits, kind of like what Teal was saying. We think that they're the ones that enjoy going to fancy gatherings, but we don't think that. But we don't think that they're the ones that would really want the power, that really want like the image of it, like a chief executive would, like people like Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk might. And we don't think that necessarily giving them the income that they have now makes any substantial difference. We think that currently they receive a pretty meager income as is. What we're saying is like, no, now you only receive that $750 an hour, and that's what you're working on. But we think this debate really rests on this final question of how does our government run better and serve people better? And another way of phrasing that question is, how do we make the impact of our aging dotard a whole lot smaller? And I think that is by, one, emphasizing civil service, emphasizing people that work in the ranks of government. I'm sorry, not right now. Is one, by compensating them better than elected officials, making that maybe be the end goal for a whole lot of middle class and lower class Americans that can make change, and can make change through civil service. There were a whole lot of people that right before Donald Trump took office hid or refiled a whole lot of climate change policies as job growth policies. That saved those climate change policies. That's what people in civil service can do. They can have really effective change where they don't have to wear a fancy suit and speak a a whole lot in front of a whole bunch of cameras. We think that's a better job, and rich people and CEOs might be better attuned to that anyway, because they've succeeded in other fields. They know how that's done. But also now civil service has more job security as well, and we think that doesn't necessarily change, but there's more emphasis on it. We think that we can encourage more people to go into it, and so that idealist that wants to make the world a better place will go to civil service, not into politics. And also, we think that government is better when you let people that have succeeded in other industries, in other fields, make decisions, when people that have been CEOs, because they've been in those really high intensity environments. They've been in those. If they know how to be efficient, they know how to understand and combine interests, and they know how to. They like being liked, and so necessarily they'll make decisions that make them look better on camera. Thank you, and we're proud to propose.
Opposition whip.
I'm Dan, by the way.
I was Saren.
I was Caleb.
Hi, Lex. I'm Sam.
Oh, I'm Jordan, by the way. Okay. Honorable Speaker, when examining this motion and the debate that has come from this motion, you really have to, at the macro level, think of what is the purpose of bringing a motion to this body. The purpose of any motion is to impact meaningful change and to enact meaningful legislation that actually does what it sets out to do. And when you examine this debate simply on that, you see that the clash in this debate really is this motion really is like elitism masquerading as some sort of populism. This is a clash of opposing the status quo, which is flawed, but replacing it with a status quo that, in the best case, cuts out working class candidates entirely, tacitly.
Here.
And worst case scenario, as the opposition has said throughout this debate, that it will open the door for big money and other forms of corruption to infiltrate politics even further than it already has. When examining the issues that this motion is meant to combat and is meant to sort of lessen the impact of, like we're looking here like having unrepresentative governments, mostly millionaires and things of that nature. The issue with representation in Congress is an issue that, like, this motion, as opposition has said, doesn't really combat the true roots of these issues. Like, opposition fails to see how enacting a legislation that makes smaller candidates more vulnerable to special interest and basically makes every politician have to cater to super PACs, special interest groups, and corporations. I fail to see how that makes candidates more representative. If these candidates are more economically representative, but in actual practice they are, answerable to big money interest groups more than they are to their own constituencies. As my partner said, this motion diminishes the quality of elected officials at every level, down like from a city clerk to other elected candidates like federal judges and things of that nature. Like, this is a really problematic motion because its goal is to sort of make our government more representative and make the people who enact laws for us feel for our struggles and the problems that we face more. But what it actually does is that it makes the private sector much more attractive to like these brilliant social scientists and physical scientists who are coming out of institutions, and these candidates maybe who are really looking at politics as a way to make a difference, even though they aren't really high up on the economic ladder. It makes staying in the private sector workforce more attractive because either you have to kowtow to special interests and sort of like not really stand for the people who you actually are meant to be standing for, or you can stay and just probably make a way more money in the private sector, working at some kind of financial firm or something of that nature. Yeah, and I fail to see. Yeah, and I also believe that when you look at the status quo, truly motivated candidates still succeed in the status quo, where if we do enact this motion, that truly motivated candidates might actually have to make difficult decisions where it's like, either I can have my livelihood or I can run for office. And it just seems like this motion, if the purpose of this motion is to have like a meaningful impact on economic representation in our government bodies, I just fail to see how this motion accomplishes any of that. As I said before, corruption is caused, by a multitude. Corruption is caused by a multitude of forces that are very complex and institutional, and like big money in politics, which has been mentioned a lot throughout this debate. And I just fail to see, again, how this motion really tackles this issue in any meaningful way. Like, all it does is sort of, again, make smaller candidates vulnerable to special interest. And this motion really is a waste of time, in my opinion, and it will be very ineffective. It actually tackling the issues at the heart of this debate. Because, again, it is just, it seems to me that this is a sort of an elitist way to sort of edge out smaller candidates, small district candidates, and people who normally, outside of the traditional campaign funding market, would have to rely on their, congressional salaries to help fund their campaigns and keep them afloat. This sort of edges those people out. And as has been said multiple times in this campaign, if we're dealing with people who are independently wealthy or who are a part of that upper strata, even if you freeze their assets, they will still have like a network of people who can help them and who they will be indebted to in some way, shape, or form. So I fail to see how that further point about freezing assets will sort of, neutralize the impact that the upper classes have in our political system. So, yeah. And if you, and you just have to see that, like, this sort of creates this system where you have these, like, at best, you have these mercenary politicians who are basically completely answerable to special interest groups, completely vulnerable in this way, and the representation that the actual constituents have in Congress and in the Senate is diminished greatly because these politicians have to worry more about, will I have money to run campaign ads and get elected if I go against what this huge donor, who I basically have to rely on potentially to live, is saying, or should I just go with what I told my constituents? And they're going to go with what the super PAC or what the corporation told them to do. And I believe that this is just further elitism that really opens the door for big money and corruption to have even more avenues to seep into our political system and edge out the influence that the small amount of influence that constituents actually have on their candidates. So basically, to wrap this up, if you really look at this motion, you're looking at a motion that not only, that at best does little to nothing, and at worst makes all the problems it hopes to tackle exponentially worse. And it is for these reasons and many more that I am proud to oppose.
Okay, thanks everyone. So we're starting kind of late, and this is obviously a trial round, so I don't want to go too line by line before I have talked to the other judges. But I do have some